Good morning, everyone. Dr. Stillman here, and today we are going to talk about MTHFR myths and legends. Lots of MTHFR content has been making the rounds recently, thanks to Gary Brecka's appearance on Joe Rogan. I like some of what Gary has to say. Some of it, I think, is either oversimplifying or lacks the realism that comes with actually taking care of people and counseling them about their diet and their lifestyle and nutrition every day. And often with the understanding of what they'll actually come back to you and say after they consume all the information in the health and wellness info space, right? So let's dive in. First of all, what is MTHFR? MTHFR, when people say, I have MTHFR or variations thereof, what they really mean is that they have a mutation in a gene that handles folate or elements of folate or folate, whatever. I'm not going to get too deep into the science on that. But basically, they have this gene that isn't as efficient as it could be. And so there's kind of a backup in this metabolic process. This backup then tends to create problems with detoxification, cellular energy generation, et cetera, et cetera. Why are we starting with a paper on homocysteine and not MTHFR? Because the literature on MTHFR is very complex. And we're going to talk about why in a minute, but ultimately the effect of MTHFR mutations on all-cause mortality, which is what I care most about, is actually somewhat minimal. And it even is conflicting in studies as to whether it exists at all. Now, we can't get into, honestly, all the reasons why that may be today, but ultimately a better marker and predictor of all-cause mortality, and therefore a better metric for us to track someone's health and wellness by, is actually homocysteine. But homocysteine is also a laboratory parameter that is fraught with confounding variables and that I don't actually put that much weight in. One of the reasons is that clinically, a couple of whiskey sours or, a big steak that's nicely char grilled and so on and so forth, I've seen have a significant effect on homocysteine. And that makes it, to me, not necessarily the best marker for real people living in the real world, eating real food. Okay. But also because there's so many other things that play into homocysteine levels. So why did I bring up this paper and what do I want to talk about here? The MTHFR genotype alone had little effect on mortality. It significantly modified the total homocysteine mortality association, which was much stronger in certain genotypes than others. What that means is that if you've got an MTHFR mutation, you're set up to have higher homocysteines. And that's why when Gary brings up the case of Dana White, he says his homocysteine was super high and this had to do with his MTHFR. That makes a lot of sense. Okay, you'll see this clinically in countless people. So elevated total homocysteine was a significant risk marker for death from all causes, and the association was subject to effect modification by MTHFR genotypes. So the MTHFR, sometimes I explain genes this way to people. I say a gene is like a blueprint for a tool. And whether or not you make that tool, or whether or not that tool or inefficiency of that tool affects your life, depends on the demands you place on the body, right? So if, for example, we're talking about tools and we're talking about the difference between a power drill and like an old-fashioned hand crank drill, well, if that's going to impact how quickly you can build houses, it actually depends on the number of drills you can make. And it depends upon other things like the number of screws that are available for the drills, the number of drill bits, and all these other variables, right? So you'll see that it's not just a slam dunk, oh, I have MTHFR, oh, I just needed this one test. You have to think more broadly than that, because many people with MTHFR mutations will start taking folate supplements, and they'll say, and good high quality supplements too. I'm not saying that they're taking the wrong ones. We're going to cover that in a minute. But they won't get the clinical results that they want. And their MTHFR problem is not just about their genes. It's about their environment. It's about their lifestyle. And that's really important for people to understand. So the second study here is homocysteine and coronary heart disease. This is a meta-analysis, a very, very large study. And this was really interesting. I'll explain why in a minute. So The background here is moderately elevated blood levels of homocysteine were weakly correlated with coronary heart disease risk, but causality remains uncertain. Translation: there's a link between high homocysteine levels and heart disease, but we aren't sure if this is cause or if it's correlation. Causation does not equal causation. Correlation does not equal causation. When folate levels are low, the certain genotype of the methylene tetrahydrofolase reductase gene, MTHFR, appreciably increases homocysteine levels. So Mendelian randomization studies using this variant as an instrumental variable could help test causality. In other words, if the gene causes the homocysteine to go up and the homocysteine is the cause of the problem, then the gene should predict the risk. Now, interestingly, they took 19 unpublished data sets. This is something that most people don't realize. When we survey the scientific literature is often actually suppressed, which is sad. It's suppressed for various reasons. Researchers don't want to publish it. They didn't have time to publish it. They don't have the grant funding to pay some minion to go publish it. It may be damaging to certain narratives. They may have gotten distracted by doing something else. There's an endless number of reasons, but we are not operating in full knowledge of all the information out there in science. And this study was interesting to me because they actually bothered to go out and get these unpublished data sets, right? And people might say, oh, well, how much could the unpublished data sets change what we're going to find? Well, in his case, it was actually a huge effect. So 19 unpublished data sets were obtained with tens of thousands of cases. Okay. I'm going to skip ahead to the good part. In meta-analyses of these unpublished data sets, the case control odds ratio, blah, 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 was 1.02 and 1.01 in unsupplemented low folate populations. By contrast, in a slightly updated meta-analysis of the 86 published studies, tens of thousands of cases in each of those as well, the odds ratio was 1.15, significantly discrepant with the odds ratio in the unpublished data sets. What this means is there's a huge gap between the unpublished and the published. So this is what we would call a publication bias. People publish things where they found a significant difference, and they didn't publish or they held back things where there wasn't a significant difference. Okay? This is one of the ways that big companies can game the scientific method and use it to create the illusion of a benefit from their product. They can also flip this around and they can create and manufacture an enormous amount of doubt by setting studies up in the wrong way in order to create a false narrative that something that works or perhaps is dangerous, something that works doesn't work, or that's dangerous is in fact safe. They do this all the time. Science is for sale. It is an industry. There is a scientific industrial complex. Sorry, that's just a reality we have to live with and deal with, okay? But it's honestly, it gets easier and easier to see through and cut through the noise, the confusion, and the propaganda the more you take care of patients, real patients in the real world, particularly when you have continuity and you have repeat labs and you get to spend time with them to find out how they're doing. Are they getting better? Are they worse? Or are they the same? What did we do? What did we change? How compliant were they? That's why I like to quote Einstein. He said, the only source of knowledge is experience. He didn't say scientific studies. He didn't say, more and more fancy lab tests. He said real, genuine, in the trenches experience. So the CI for the overall result from large unpublished data sets shows lifelong moderate homocysteine elevation has little to no effect on coronary heart disease. The discrepant overall result from previously published studies reflects publication bias or methodological problems. What they mean is that measuring homocysteine levels does not necessarily help us in taking care of people, and that this is probably, if not entirely, due to a publication bias. I'm not willing to completely dismiss the importance of homocysteine levels by any means. I'm very open to testing them and trending them, but I also have a deep appreciation for how flawed they are. Let's talk about a marker that I actually think is much more useful and much more helpful and that I trend much more often, which is the high sensitivity CRP. Why do I trend the high sensitivity CRP rather than the homocysteine? So number one, it's more robust. It is a better predictor of heart disease than the homocysteine. Number two, it doesn't have as many confounding variables. If you have an elevated high sensitivity CRP, by definition, you have inflammation in your body. Number three, I can use it to reassure the patient. I can't tell you how many people come to me and they say, I feel like I'm dying. What's wrong with me? And their high sensitivity CRP level is low, even very low, in the very, very low risk range. And I'll reassure them and I'll say, I understand that you feel like you're dying. However, your data suggests that you have low levels of total body inflammation, which means that if we can just change a few things, you might be shocked at how much better you'll feel and function, right? And this gets into the diet and the lifestyle and the behavior change that we do at my practice, right? So why is high sensitivity CRP something that I'm so enthusiastic about checking? Here's why. And just to be clear, high sensitivity CRP, to give you a little bit more background, is mostly used to prognosticate someone's risk of heart disease, okay? Now, I view it as a marker that likely and arguably is also useful for predicting risks of things like cancer and stroke and chronic lung or kidney disease. Why? Because when you look at the literature on chronic inflammation, it's very clear that chronic inflammation is linked to overall worse health and shorter lifespan, right? Shorter health span overall. So arguably one of the great goals of a physician should be to minimize the amount of inflammation within the person, period, end of story, right? Notice that that's not true for homocysteine. As homocysteine goes up, you don't necessarily see more and more inflammation. Otherwise, the association between higher homocysteine levels and earlier mortality and more morbidity would be very, very clear, and it would be very significant, right? The high sensitivity CRP is primarily a test that tells us about risk for heart disease, but there is literature suggesting it also protects risk for other issues, and I think that's only going to get stronger. And that's largely based on my clinical experience. So subjects with the highest high sensitivity CRP levels increased by 75% the risk of all-cause mortality. So in other words, if I drop you from the highest high sensitivity CRP level to the lowest, I dropped, and I'm not going to say I because I'm just a guide, but we together dropped their all-cause mortality by 75%. I will show up for a 75% improvement in all-cause mortality all day, every day until I die myself. That is a huge improvement. And what I've found, having tested hundreds, if not thousands of these levels in people who thought they were healthy and well, is that a huge proportion of you are a ticking time bomb. You think it's just a little bit of extra weight. You think it's just allergies. You think it's just occasional sinus headaches. You think it's just this or that or the other thing. You minimize these problems with your health. You take drugs, you take medications, you do things in order to mitigate the symptoms. And then you finally, boom, one day it's a heart attack, it's a stroke, it's a serious health crisis that has come to a head. And if we'd found your high sensitivity CRP earlier, we could have intervened sooner. And one of the things I've found is that people sometimes need the labs in order to be convinced to really come to Jesus. Happy Easter, he has risen. And I say that because people sometimes just want to pretend that the little extra weight is not a big deal. And to be honest with you, sometimes they're right. Sometimes they have very low levels of inflammation. They're actually quite fit, and they can stand to have an extra 5 to 10 pounds of weight without it really meaningfully impacting their quality and their quantity of life. And I'm frank with people about that. I level with them. But sometimes we find people who are in a high risk category and they have to get serious about their wellness, or they're going to wind up on the stretcher, in the cardiac ICU, in the cath lab, on the table, getting their chest cracked for their first cabbage. Heart disease is still the #1 killer of Americans. Last I checked, don't worry. Cancer is probably, I don't know if cancer is going to outrank it soon, but rates of both are going up and ages are getting earlier and earlier for various reasons we won't get into here. Anyway, back to this paper. Subjects with the highest high sensitivity CRP levels increased by 2.03-fold the risk of cardiovascular mortality. Twofold. That's a huge increase. Okay. High sensitivity CRP can stratify cardiovascular and all-cause mortality risk in the general population. That's a big deal. I'm really enthusiastic, if you can't tell, about reducing all-cause mortality. So Conclusion: elevated high sensitivity CRP levels can independently predict risk of all-cause cardiovascular mortality in the general population. You will not find researchers who are cagey and conservative by nature making statements like this about homocysteine as conclusively as they do about high sensitivity CRP. Okay? Homocysteine can be helpful. It can be a clue, but I don't hang my hat on it. Okay? Let's talk a little bit more about why. So one of my concerns with homocysteine levels is the degree to which it can vary. Okay? This is a study where they looked at the intra-individual biological variability of plasma homocysteine. So in this one, they noticed that it's relatively low, 8.3%, indicating that a single measurement can be used to characterize the average homocysteine concentration. However, I take issue with this. Let's say that they're wrong. And for the sake of me doing math easily in my head, it's 10%, which is close to 8.3. And the average homocysteine is something like 7 or 8. But here's the thing. The low end of the homocysteine range is like 5, 6, let's call it 7. The high end is 12, 13, 14. That's a very short window. And 10% of 7 is 0.7. 10% of 14 is 1.4. So small things could push people from lower or higher ranges relatively easily. I'm not comfortable with this level of variability, even though technically, by the standards of analytical chemistry, this is a small error range. If you have the time to educate the patient and they have the time in their life to take the time to have a consistent diet, lifestyle, exercise regimen, etc., you may see that they have consistent levels of things like homocysteine. But I know from having monitored my own labs that even I eat the same thing almost every day. I wake up, I have the same daily routine. I have the same exercise routine. I have the same levels of stress. My life is very dialed in compared to the vast majority of people. And I still have huge variability in my labs. So I'm hesitant to trust this because one of the things I've noticed is that if you get a falsely low or normal or optimal reading in someone who you know needs to fix their diet and lifestyle, you are basically giving them an excuse to what I call kick the can of their wellness down the road. And that is basically giving them enough rope to hang themselves with. And I don't like to do that. So anyway, we determined age and gender-specific central intervals and found that subjects in the highest quartile of serum folate had significantly lower mean plasma homocysteine concentrations than did those in the lowest quartile of folate values. Okay? What this means is the more folate you push in, the lower the homocysteine level is. But this isn't a slam dunk for just taking and consuming more folate. They wrap up their abstract with an ideal homocysteine reference range based on targeting those subjects who are likely to be folate replete is preferable to the population-based range using the central 0.95 interval. What they mean by that is that instead of using a standard population-wide reference range, we should probably come up with an optimal homocysteine level. I agree. We have that level. I don't recall it off the top of my head because I don't run serum folates that often because I'm more interested in other labs and I have plenty of work to do in the other labs. Okay. And for the record, I'll run homocysteine levels if people want them. I just haven't been recently. Okay. So more folate, lower homocysteine. Now, where does this leave me as a clinician? Well, one of the things that we do in my practice that I think really sets us apart and helps us get superior outcomes in our field is we actually talk to people about what they eat. One of my favorite sayings is a Chinese proverb that states, "He who takes medicine and neglects diet wastes the skill of the physician." Sir William Osler said, "One of the chief duties of the physician is to educate the masses, not to take medicine." I could not agree more. People read this stuff on homocysteine and this stuff on folate and they think, aha, if I take more folate, I will be more better. No, stop it. Okay. A lot of you are not even eating remotely the right amount of folate for you, which is going to vary massively depending upon who you are. We have our own ways and means of assessing folate status in the practice that I won't get into here. But suffice it to say, one of the things I see consistently is that people have no earthly idea how to eat a lot of folate. They don't even know what that means. So let's talk about it. I added 4 of my favorite folate-rich foods to this day in Chronometer, which is what we use to help people track and understand their diet. I added 1 cup of each of these things cooked in the form that you would most commonly consume it in, like spinach, lentils, black beans, and broccoli. Okay, now let's look at the amount of folate coming in from these various foods. So the total intake of folate, if you eat 1 cup of lentils, 1 cup of black beans, 1 cup of broccoli, and 1 cup of spinach all on the same day, not an unrealistic goal. By the way, and for the record, that's only 500 calories. That's like a meal, 1 meal for me. Not that I would eat 2 cups of beans and a cup of beans and a cup of lentils at one sitting. I don't recommend that for various reasons that I won't get into right now. But look at how much folate comes in. So lentils are, in my opinion, prove me wrong. If you have a better food, drop it in the comments. A more dense folate food, drop it in the comments. Lentils are the king of the folate hill. 358.4 micrograms per cup. That is insane. It is head and shoulders above the next one that is my favorite, which is black beans. Look through the beans and legumes. No other food comes close to them as a food group for folate intake. And here's one of the problems with them, though. Folate is heat and light sensitive, which means the more that you freeze and the more that you boil and the more that you reheat and the more that you boil these foods, the more you're going to break down the folate. Okay? So can we get the same amount of folate from canned as we can from dried and then cooked fresh? No, we can't. Okay? Are we going to get the same amount of folate from, say, sprouted lentils that have been soaked and carefully sprouted than we will from lentils that are just boiled? I would submit to you, although I haven't fact-checked this, that we do not. This is why I buy dried legumes and I cook them myself in an Instant Pot or a slow cooker. And I try to avoid recooling them and reheating them. I'm trying to keep it as fresh as possible. Because just think about it. If freezing a food, like say spinach, destroys just 20% of the folate, and these numbers are low. If it destroys 20%, boom, you're picking up frozen spinach in the grocery store, you just lost 20% of the folate. You're reheating it. Boom, let's say it drops it by 20%. You just lost 40% of the folate in that spinach. And this is one of the biggest misconceptions that I want to address today. People think that green leafy vegetables are the king of the hill for folate and you can have a normal folate intake if you just eat enough of them. I would beg to differ. It is possible to get a lot of folate from green leafy vegetables, but you have to eat like a rabbit. There's only 58 micrograms of folate in raw spinach. This raw spinach. I will allow that there's other forms of spinach. There's competing nutritional databases. Maybe this is off, but think about it. Even if there's twice as much spinach or folate in spinach as I'm showing you here, if it's like 100 micrograms per cup, you've got to eat 2.5 cups of raw spinach to get the same amount of folate as you did from 1 cup of black beans. Now, what is more likely for you to eat a cup of black beans or a cup of lentils or, 3 or 4 cups of spinach? This is a really important variable for people. This is why I often observe that in high, and this is another thing about folate that I want you guys to know. So folate is light sensitive. That's why in the hospital, when we hang folate as an IV medication, which we occasionally have to do, we hang a brown bag around it. The brown bag blocks blue and ultraviolet type light. Okay, and that prevents the folate from being degraded by the light. This is really important. Do you maybe think that baking in ultraviolet light all day, as one would in a place like Nicaragua, shout out to Jim. Jim lives in Nicaragua. If you don't know him, he works with me. Go watch some of our webinars. Go watch our webinar on Saturday. It was great. How to beat burnout, holistic strategies for sustainable energy. Do you not think that living in Nicaragua and baking in a UV index of 15 for hours a day might cause a higher folate demand than, say, just freezing through the Minnesota winter? I suggest that it does. There's a pittance of literature on this. No one is studying this, sadly, in my opinion. But I wouldn't be surprised if we saw significantly increased folate requirements in people who are getting more and more and more sun. Do I think it's a coincidence that high folate foods tend to grow more in an abundance in high light environments like the tropics? I don't think that's a coincidence at all. That's why I like to joke that humans are the only species on planet Earth that's that eats a non-local, non-seasonal diet and argues about what to eat. Everything else is not worried about it. They just eat what occurs in nature and what comes naturally. And we have all these chronic degenerative diseases that are linked to nutrition. And a lot of it, I believe, is because we're overcomplicating things. If it's growing in your environment and it's been considered edible and good food and good for people for millennia by the locals, it's probably a good idea to eat it in that zip code. Okay. And people who tell you otherwise are often out on a very, very, very thin scientific limb, so to speak. So back to folate. You'll notice that all these foods tend to grow better in high light environments, and that there's not a lot of folate-rich foods in cold, dark environments. I believe the need for this nutrient may and likely varies seasonally, but I can't prove that, frankly. So what's one of the first things I do with people who I suspect have an MTHFR problem, who have a folate problem, maybe a homocysteine problem? I'll say, are you eating beans? How often? How much? Are you eating things like broccoli and spinach and green leafy vegetables? Because that's the lowest hanging fruit that I can hand them, not just for now, not just for the next 3 months, but for the rest of their life to improve their health. Okay. Next, let's talk about folate intake and its effects on mortality, right? So if not having enough folate can create these problems with homocysteine, and this correlates with problems with early death and disease, it stands to reason that giving people more folate might reduce their risk of death. Okay. But we don't actually see this, and let's talk about why. All right. So this was an incredibly big study, 98,000 person years, 2,000 deaths, 682 deaths from cardiovascular disease. They found a J-shaped association. Modest intake of total folate equivalents and daily folate equivalents was associated with lower risk of cardiovascular mortality and all-cause mortality, whereas higher intake did not persistently reduce these risks. So more does not equal better. A J-shaped association looks like this, just like a J. It starts out up here, and then it comes down, and then it comes back up. Sometimes this is called a U-shaped association. There's a lot of commonality between them, and you see them a lot in biological systems. This is why when people come to me and they say, well, I'm taking a folate supplement. I was told I would need to take this forever by my whoever, doctor, naturopath, therapist, I don't care, best friend, the internet. I will talk to them and say, why do we really believe you need this? Because let's be real. If you're supplementing with, let's say, 2 milligrams of folate a day, which would be a lot compared to what you can eat. Well, I just showed you guys with 4 simple foods, 1 cup of each a day, you can get to 800 micrograms of folate. So your diet does matter. Your food preparation does matter. He who takes medicine and ignores diet wastes the skill of the physician. It's a huge mistake. And many people make it, partly because there's an agenda. There's a lot of money to be made just putting people on auto ship on supplements and having them consume them around the clock, essentially. All right. This study suggested the beneficial effects of modest folate intake on the improvement of long-term survival, emphasized the potentially deleterious effects of excess folic acid supplementation amongst U.S. adults at high risk. Okay, I want to bring out a few things they say here that are important. Number one, it suggests that there's a beneficial effect of modest folate intake, not high folate intake. You really, frankly, only get to high folate intakes when you're supplementing. How many of you are really going to go out there and eat a cup of black beans or lentils for breakfast, lunch, and dinner? Not many of you, if any of you. Okay. If you are going to do that, guess what? You're going to be one of the most active people out there. And that means you're going to have a higher demand for all the things that folate is necessary for, like making hormones and neurotransmitters, which are essential for responding to stress, right? So you got to understand your intake should vary based on your stress levels and your activity levels, which are sort of the same thing. They emphasize also the potentially deleterious effects of excess folic acid supplementation. Now, why could excess folic acid create problems? That's because not all folate is created equal. So external supplementation of folate may occur as folic acid, folinic acid, or 5-methylene tetrahydrofolate. Okay. Now, these are not the same thing, and you need different enzymes in order to convert these things. And if you've got, say, an MTHFR mutation, putting folic acid into the tank may be worse than not adding it at all. And if you didn't know, a lot of the idiots in charge don't understand these distinctions, and they think that just putting someone with MTHFR or folate deficiency on folic acid is doing them a favor. If that person has genetic mutations that render them incapable of using said folic acid, it may be like throwing gasoline on a fire, which is why I like to use methylated B vitamins. All right. Using it 5-MTHF, that's 5-methylene tetrahydrofolate, instead of folic acid, reduces the potential for masking hematological symptoms of vitamin B12 deficiency, reduces interactions with drugs that inhibit dihydrofolate reductase, and overcomes metabolic defects caused by methylene tetrahydrofolate reductase polymorphism. Use of 5-MTHF also prevents the potential negative effects of unconverted folic acid in the peripheral circulation. Okay? So the takeaway from that is the form matters. And this comes back to the first couple of studies we covered. Why? Because these people did not mention in their studies if they were assessing in any way whether these people were taking folic acid or 5-MTHF or folinic acid or any other type of folate. They also weren't assessing them for folate's friends, B6 and B12 and other things like that. And that's why it gets so complicated. And I'm not here to complicate it for you. I'm here to make it simple. Let's do an essential lab panel that covers things that we know predict your risk of morbidity and mortality, that we know come back to and predict your overall quality of life and quantity of life, that are fundamental to your biology, fundamental to your well-being. And then let's trend those over time and see what happens. Let's take a look in detail at what you're actually eating instead of just guessing and saying things like, oh, I eat a lot of protein. What does that mean? Oh, I eat a lot of folate. What does that mean? What kind of folate-rich foods are you eating? What is the quantity? All of this matters. And the lack of attention to detail and the lack of appreciation for the fact that small hinges swing big doors are why the vast majority of healthcare consumers are getting mediocre to poor results, are often bouncing from doctor to doctor to doctor, or expert to expert, or guru to guru, and never understanding the fundamentals of what make them healthy and create their illness, let alone figuring out what they're going to have to change in order to, as I like to say, create their wellness. So, as always, it's wonderful joining you all here for these Monday Masterclasses. These are published on my Substack, stillmanmd.substack.com, where I also publish protocols from my practice and other premium content for my premium subscribers. Happy Easter again. He has risen. What else? Make sure you're on the newsletter at stillmanwellness.com for updates on our free weekly webinars and also on our course and program updates and when they enroll. These are basically all time sensitive now, so you've got to be on the list if you want to get the update. Also, they like to cancel people who speak the truth, so make sure you're on the email list because we could disappear at any time for saying something that the people in charge don't like, which if you found this video, you probably understand all too well. All right, take care, everyone. Have a great day, and don't forget to get outside.